Good evening, I'm Nima, and this is Forum Daily for Wednesday, May 25th. Tonight, Canada joins others in mourning the shooting deaths of 19 American students, even though change may not be imminent. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is joining other world leaders in mourning the students from a small-town elementary school in Uvalde, Texas. But state politicians may not adopt any significant new limits on guns. Last year, gun laws were actually loosened after a gunman at a Walmart in El Paso killed 23 people in a racist 2019 attack that targeted Hispanics. Back at home, there are still more than 250,000 customers without electricity in Ontario and Quebec. This comes following Saturday's storm that killed at least 10 people. 3 communities declared states of emergency: Uxbridge, Clarence Rockland, and the township of Greater Madawaska. The wind hit more than 130 kilometers an hour in Kitchener, about an hour west of Toronto. Staying in Ontario, where Progressive Conservative leader Doug Ford says he wants to look into additional supports for adults with autism. His government has faced much criticism over its handling of services for children with autism, and he says he supports them, but he is also hearing that more supports are needed once the kids turn 18. The other 3 parties are pledging changes to the Tories' autism program. This includes making it fully needs-based and removing caps on age as a determining factor in the amount of treatment. The Tories tried to roll out a new autism program in 2019 with the aim of clearing the wait list, but they scrapped it after it sparked outrage among parents. On the West Coast, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was forced to cancel his appearance at a Liberal Party fundraising event in Surrey, BC. This came after protesters began harassing attendees. 2 speakers at last night's event said several dozen protesters hurled racial slurs at the mostly South Asian attendees entering a convention center. Mr. Trudeau did not enter the building due to safety reasons and spoke to the crowd via Zoom for about 3 minutes. He said no one should be intimidated or stopped from exercising their democratic freedoms. Meanwhile, candidates running for leadership of the federal Conservative Party will hold the party's French language debate tonight in Laval, Quebec. Former Quebec Premier Jean Charest and Ottawa area MP Pierre Poilievre are expected to dominate much of the debate, as both can speak French fluently. A language reform bill has just passed in Quebec's legislature, but critics say it goes too far in protecting the French language. This by potentially denying the province's Anglophones the ability to access services like healthcare in English. Back in the West, prices continue to skyrocket for renters. A report by Rentals.ca says Vancouver is still the most expensive Canadian city for renters. The average rent was $2,925 in April. This is up 29.9% from the same time last year. That was the highest year-over-year price hike in the country. All right, moving to a new study by RBC and the Canadian think tank Youthful Cities, which has found that Halifax is the least affordable city for young people between the ages of 15 and 29. The study compared the cost of living and average income for young people in 27 cities. It found that the typical young person runs an average deficit of $750 a month. This while young people in Halifax run average monthly deficits of almost $1,300 per month. CFL Commissioner Randy Ambrosi says the league has tabled its final offer to the Players Association. He says the new proposal includes a $1 million ratification bonus pool for players, and it reduces the proposed number of nationalized Canadians from 4 to 1. It also cuts back on the number of Canadian starters from 7 to 6. The new offer is on the table until midnight Eastern Time on Thursday. All right, well, meanwhile, the federal and provincial governments are each committing $15 million in support of the 2025 Invictus Games in Vancouver and Whistler. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Premier John Horgan made the announcement at Rogers Arena in Vancouver yesterday. The 8-day international sports competition will feature over 500 wounded and ill military veterans from more than 20 nations. From sports to comedy, the 40th anniversary of Montreal's famed Just for Laughs festival will feature some big names in the lineup this summer. After 2 years of virtual and hybrid festivals, the Canadian Comedy Celebration is adding more acts to its in-person event. This is including comedians Amy Schumer, Jimmy Carr, and Fortune famester. Other acts joining the schedule include homegrown comics Rick Mercer and Catherine Ryan. Other comics like Kevin Hart, John Mulaney, and Chelsea Handler, as well as Russell Peters, are also scheduled. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Quebec health officials are reporting 10 more cases of monkeypox, bringing the total confirmed cases in the province to 15. Last week, Quebec reported the first cases of the virus in Canada. The Public Health Agency of Canada said last week that it was already investigating about 24 possible cases of monkeypox in the country. Meanwhile, Toronto Public Health says there are 2 new suspected cases of monkeypox in the city. There is also 1 probable case of the disease that's under investigation. The rare disease comes from the same family of viruses that causes smallpox. Well, joining us now to tell us a little bit more about monkeypox in our weekly medical segment is Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director at Appletree Medical Group. Dr. Raut, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Pleasure to be here.
So what do we know so far about monkeypox and how it affects the body?
Well, monkeypox is an extremely rare disease, a less severe cousin of smallpox. We know that there have been about 250 cases in about 16 countries around the world. And we do know that it's spread by close and prolonged contact with an infected individual. So there's an incubation period of about 7 to 14 days. The symptoms are typically flu-like with fevers, chills, exhaustion, headache, and muscle weakness. And then we see this widespread rash that appears. They're painful raised pocks. They're fluid-filled and surrounded by red circles. Then those lesions scab over and resolve over a period of 2 to 3 weeks. So what we are seeing here is something very similar to smallpox, but just less severe.
Sounds like a condition no one wants, Dr. Raut. Now, these cases seem to be increasing since first being reported in Canada just last week. So should Canadians be concerned about this?
I think that's a very good point. Overall, what we're seeing is this is a disease that has been around for quite some time. We're talking about humans since 1970. So when we look at Canada, we would see the occasional outbreak here, but we do know that the risk of infection is relatively low. We'll probably hear more outbreaks coming in the next hours and days, but overall, what we're seeing is this type of smallpox is likely a 1% mortality rate, even in the most severe cases there.
And as you mentioned, this does come from the same family of viruses that causes smallpox. How does monkeypox compare to smallpox?
So now smallpox was really eradicated worldwide in 1980. It is also primarily spread by direct contact, prolonged face-to-face contact with people, as well as objects contaminated by infected fluids like bedding or even clothing. So with smallpox patients, become contagious as soon as they develop sores and spread throughout. They remained contagious until their lesions completely resolved there. Based on the information we're seeing so far, monkeypox is far less contagious than that, so there's less concern on that.
All right, well, that's good to hear. But how can people stay safe from contracting monkeypox this summer?
So that's a good question. I think the important thing here is, close contact with an infected individual is required for that spread of monkeypox. So infection can really develop after exposure to broken skin, mucous membranes, respiratory droplets, infected body fluids, or even contact with any sort of linen. So when the lesions have healed, the scabs themselves may also shed, which could technically be inhaled. So there are a couple of ways that we can see that transmission occur. So our public health is really advising similar things that we've heard before: physical distancing, frequent hand washing and masking, and all of these measures that we're really using to fight the COVID-19 pandemic.
And what steps should people take if they are infected with monkeypox, Dr. Raut?
What we know is isolation and quarantine work really well to limit the spread of monkeypox. The only issue is, we're seeing the symptoms prolonged for extended weeks. So unlike COVID-19, where we would recommend isolation for a shorter duration, for monkeypox, we would recommend the isolation be about 3 weeks. And that way we decrease the potential to be in contact with someone else who could get that.
All right, Dr. Raut, just about a minute left here, but what does the discovery of monkeypox mean for the COVID-19 pandemic?
I think that's a good question, and I'm sure we are hoping for no more pandemics in the future. But monkeypox, with the world, I would say the world is facing a very different situation compared to the early days of COVID-19. Monkeypox is in many ways a known quantity. We have tools to prevent it as well, and we certainly know far more about it than we did when COVID-19 first struck. But both public health and the general public have had a lot of practice taking in these measures, preventing infections in general from spreading. So I remain quite cautiously optimistic that despite any trajectory or increase, we're going to stay vigilant and stay on top of this.
I'm sure that's good to hear for our viewers. Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director at Appletree Medical Group, thank you again for your time today.
Thanks so much.
All right, when we come back from the break, we turn our attention to the human rights situation in China. Stay with us. We'll be speaking with Dr. Charles Burton. Chinese leader Xi Jinping has defended China's record to the top UN human rights official, this while criticizing those countries that he said lecture others on human rights and politicize the issue. He told visiting UN Human Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet that China has embarked on a path of human rights development and suits its own national conditions. The two spoke on video phone. Ms. Bachelet is on a 6-day visit to China that includes Xinjiang, a region where Chinese governments have been accused of human rights violations. Her trip has been criticized by the U.S. and others who think that China will use it for propaganda purposes. With us now to discuss the visit is Dr. Charles Burton, an expert on China and senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Sir, welcome back to Forum Daily.
It's good to speak with you again.
So what is the UN Human Rights Chief looking to accomplish with this trip to China?
Well, certainly the UN Human Rights Chief has been under a lot of pressure to try to come to terms with the very serious allegations of genocide committed by the government of China against the Uyghur ethnic minority. And so, she's been negotiating to visit China for quite some time. It seems that she will be able to travel to China, but the issue really is, will she see anything of the evidence of genocide, or will her trip be so carefully vetted that she will only see facilities which are not reflective of the reality on the ground? And certainly the Chinese government has already said that because of the COVID-19 pandemic, she will be kept in what they refer to as a bubble, which means that there will be no foreign journalists accompanying her, and she will likely have no spontaneous contact with anybody in China while she's there.
And we know China's president is saying that other countries are politicizing human rights issues. So what does China's president mean by that?
Well, China rejects the idea of universal values and clearly doesn't want to be compliant with the international norms of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that should be extending to Chinese citizens entitlements to freedom of expression and freedom of choice of their political leaders and independent judiciary. Under the Chinese Communist Party's rule, none of these are allowed for Chinese people. So China is very sensitive on the issue of human rights because they're not prepared to extend any human rights to their population. And so this becomes an issue in our relations, because we expect that human rights is a universal norm that should be universally respected, regardless of where the humans are, that they should all be given the entitlements of citizenship. So China on the one hand claims that they maintain human rights in a Chinese way, but on the other hand, there's nothing about the Chinese Communist Party's rule which is any way consistent with human rights doctrine as we understand it.
And staying on the topic of human rights, we know this trip would include a visit to the Xinjiang region. So tell our viewers, we just have about 2 minutes, so really briefly, can you tell us about the situation there with the Uyghur minorities?
Well, the Uyghurs are about 11 million people living in the northwestern part of the People's Republic of China, who speak a language that is similar to Turkish, and they look like like Turkish people. They don't look like Chinese at all. The Chinese government wants to assimilate them to Han Chinese norms, to learn Mandarin Chinese, and support China's rise to power led by the Han minority. Many Uyghurs would prefer to be ruled by their own people in their own area, which they refer to as East Turkestan. And the Chinese government is therefore trying to eliminate the Uyghur culture and language and religious practice to try and suppress this separatist tendency and dissatisfaction of the Uyghurs with Chinese rule from Beijing.
All right. Well, Dr. Burton, just about 30 seconds left here, but what do you expect from this trip?
Well, I'm not optimistic that the UN chief will come back with any kind of meaningful report on the situation of the Uyghurs, but let's see what she says when she returns to the UN, and hopefully we'll make some progress in understanding exactly what China's doing in those regions. And it's pretty clear that it amounts to genocide under the UN Genocide Convention.
We'll definitely have to keep our eyes out for that. Dr. Burton, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Very good to speak with you.
Stay with us. Up next, we've got more news from around the world. More details have been released about the gunman involved in an elementary school shooting in Texas. The UN reports that over 1 million children in Afghanistan are likely to face severe malnutrition this year. And Ukraine's president suggests a first step to negotiating an end to the war. These stories and more coming up next. A Texas official has released more details on the 18-year-old gunman involved in the deadly shooting at an elementary school in Uvalde. They say he carried a long rifle with multiple rounds of ammunition and wore a tactical vest. The shooter killed 19 children and 2 adults. Texas Governor Greg Abbott shared that 30 minutes before the shooting, the gunman posted on social media that he was going to shoot his grandmother. He then posted that he had shot the woman, and finally he posted that he was going to shoot up a school. Lieutenant Christopher Olivares of the Texas Department of Public Safety called the shooter an evil person who had a complete disregard for human life. All right, moving to Afghanistan now, where 1.1 million children under the age of 5 will likely face the most severe form of malnutrition this year, according to the UN. Massive humanitarian programs by aid organizations have succeeded so far in staving off famine for 6 months, but they are struggling to keep pace with relentlessly worsening conditions. Mohammed Ayoya, a UNICEF representative in Afghanistan, says admissions of children with severe acute malnutrition to health facilities have mounted from 16,000 in March 2020 to 28,000 in March 2022. As the war in Ukraine continues, the president of the country says it will not give up land in return for an end to the conflict with Russia. Speaking by video link in Davos, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said he didn't believe Russian President Vladimir Putin fully understood what was going on in Ukraine. Mr. Zelensky suggested a first step to negotiating an end to the war, saying that Russia should at least withdraw troops and equipment to the positions they held before February 24th. All right, well, meanwhile, Swedish and Finnish delegations met with Turkish officials today in Ankara. This to try to overcome Turkey's strong objections to their bids to join NATO. Turkey has issues with the Nordic country's perceived support of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, which it sees as a security threat. Earlier this week, Turkey listed 5 concrete assurances that it was demanding from Sweden, which includes the lifting of arms sanctions against Turkey and global cooperation against terrorism. This comes as financial officials at the World Economic Forum's annual gathering in Davos say Russia's war in Ukraine has been a major setback to the global economic recovery. Geeta Gopinath, the IMF's first deputy managing director, said today that a confluence of shocks are hitting the world. She says there is a cost of living crisis coupled with rising interest rates to tackle high inflation, a real estate sector facing weaknesses, and a Chinese slowdown amid COVID-19 lockdowns. Turning to India now, which is restricting its sugar exports to 10 million tons in the current season. This to help maintain domestic availability and keep prices stable. Wednesday's decision follows a similar measure for wheat and comes amid signs of tightening world supplies. India is the second largest producer and biggest consumer of sugar, and it is the second largest exporter of sugar in the world. The export curbs are the first in 6 years. Turning to the UK now, where British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says he takes full responsibility for everything that took place in the Partygate scandal. But he's ignoring calls for his resignation following the release of senior civil servant Sue Gray's report. It looked into government parties that happened during coronavirus lockdowns. The report says the blame for rule breaking lies at the top of government. But Mr. Johnson continues to insist that he did not knowingly break any rules. And he says that it's time to move on. Ms. Gray investigated 16 gatherings attended by Mr. Johnson and his staff in 2020 and in 2021. This while people across the country were barred from socializing or from even visiting sick and dying relatives. South of our border, there will be a candlelight vigil in Minneapolis this evening. It will be in memory of George Floyd's death 2 years ago today. He died after a white police officer pinned his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck while he was handcuffed. The officer did so for more than 9 minutes, ignoring Mr. Floyd's pleas that he couldn't breathe. The city plans to unveil a street sign officially naming the intersection where he died George Perry Floyd Square. The Olympic Refugee Foundation and the Refugee Olympics team are celebrating. They have won the Princess of Asturias Award for sports. This for their work to help refugee athletes. The International Olympic Committee founded the refugee team so athletes in conflict zones and places where human rights are violated could still compete. All right, I'm Nima Rajan. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily News.